Great. So a couple objectives we have for this class is learning a couple ways our trees, and with this a combined class, a little bit of fire ecology, a little bit about protecting your home from wildfire. So it's kind of a very brief overview. I have in the chat some links that are much more in depth on both of these subjects. One's focused on Eastern, one is focused on Western. So a couple things we're hoping to do in this class is learn a couple ways plants have adapted to wildfire. Learn about one of our native trees in the state of Washington is dependent on wildfire. Talk about fire regimes and the different regimes we have in the state of Washington. And talk about what steps you can do as homeowners to reduce the risk of your home starting in the next wildfire. A couple things, anytime a presentation, we gotta start with some definitions because there's a lot of these floating out there. And what I want to talk about is fire adaptation and fire dependency. When we're talking about plants, fire adaptation is something the plant has done so it can live and survive a wildfire. So it's an adaptation. Well, the key thing about adaptation with plants, the adaptations can actually be broken down in two categories, then surviving the individual and species. Where fire dependency is that plant, that tree needs fire to be successful, okay, grow successfully. One of the things in nature is I can always find these plants or trees that we say need fire growing without fire, but they do it by just surviving. Okay, one of the things about plants, they want to be successful. So when we think about this stuff, we're thinking about where the condition that they're successful in. With plant adaptations, we're going to cover on survival. The plants survive wildfire two ways. A, the plant actually survives fire itself, or it may survive as a species. In that case, the plant dies, but the species survives. And there's several adaptations we're going to cover. We cover resistors, sprouters, seeders, invaders, and avoiders categories. And most plants have more than one adaptation to live with wildfire. The first one I want to talk about is resistors. These resist dying. They resist the heat. They try to make sure the heat doesn't kill the tree. And these plants and trees specifically survive as an individual. That means that tree will live through the fire. One of the things they do is they have very, very thick bark. They also have things to protect the bud. That's the end of the branch. That's where the new growth comes out every year. And they have mechanisms to protect that bud by a large size, or the needles actually may go around the bud to help shield some of the heat. So it has two different mechanisms there to survive the fire. And this one is one of our ponderosa pines in eastern Washington, western larch, as well as Douglas fir. When it gets older, the Douglas fir on both sides of the mountain will get that thick bark as a mechanism to resist dying in a wildfire. One another adaptation our plants may have is sprouters, we call it, and they do survive as individual. What happens there is the fire will come through the area. They actually may kill what we see, but the base of that plant, right at the ground level, we call the root crown, that actually survives. This is an aspen stand here. And one of the things with this aspen stand, the trees you will see dead trees, but the crowns are still alive, and that new sunlight will help them resprout. So aspens are a common one. A lot of our shrubs and grasses survive by resprouting. You will see nothing. You'll see death. But under the ground, they'll resprout and you'll see new growth the following year. Another mechanism some of our species of plants have to survive wildfire is what we call cedars. These plants and trees often die in a wildfire, but they will survive as a species because they have mechanisms to ensure that they reseed after a fire. A couple of the mechanisms, they could be the seeds could have a hard shell so it doesn't dry up and burn up in a wildfire. This is a special cone we call serotinous cones. They stay closed like this until they reach a certain temperature, and then they open up to drop the seed. And this is from lodgepole pine. A couple other species that survive are what we call cedars is ceanothus. It's a plant that has a lot of seeds in the ground, and it takes heat for those seeds to start to grow again. And so they just store a bunch of seed in the soils until fire comes and warms them up enough, breaks that shell a little bit so they can resprout. And a lot of our noxious weeds are actually cedars. They're invaders, and they come in with seeds to overtake areas that's been disturbed. Speaking of invaders, that's another category. They come and take over an area after fire is there, and they're not usually on the landscape or on your land before a fire. These plants, like fireweed, which is a native plant, um, they disperse their seeds by wind. Think of dandelion type plants. Those seeds carry very distance until they land in a place that's recently burned, which they like, and they resprout there and help take over that site. A lot of our noxious weeds are this type of plant because they are invaders. They come in after disturbance, so that's their niche in nature. Another category, and this is the one if for Western Washington we see more of, we call them avoiders. These trees survive as individuals. The key thing is they just don't grow in areas where we have a lot of fire. They grow in moist areas, high elevation areas, areas with a lot of precip or cooler areas. So they just generally grow in a site or an area that doesn't necessarily have a lot of wildfires. So those cooler, more moist sites. With that, they often have thin bark. They have shallow roots. So what that means is when fire does come through those areas, that the tree itself won't survive. So they can't survive fire around them. They just try to make sure they grow in an area that has very infrequent fire. What our cedars, our hemlocks, our spruces, all examples of trees that grow in these moist, cool areas, and so they don't get exposed to fire. So that's their mix in surviving. Back to my definitions, I talk about fire dependency. These are plants that may need fire to be successful. And the classic example, this one I showed you earlier, which is lodgepole pine. The seeds stay in the cones like this, and the cones don't drop annually like you'd see in the Douglas fir, pines, and spruces. They'll just stay on the tree year after year in this closed condition. When fire comes through, they may fall to the ground or stay in the tree. The heat opens them up and the seeds drop. We can see this was a serotinous cone because if you notice, only the outer edges was burnt. The inside is not burned because it stayed closed. Then after the fire went through, the heat allowed it to open up the cone and then the seeds dropped. And lodgepole pine in our Pacific Northwest is our prime example of this. If you guys were around in '88 and remember the Yellowstone fires, which is a lodgepole pine ecosystem, the picture on the left was taken in '88, dead trees, devastated forests at the time. Okay. But if we look on the right, 10 years later, what we have, a forest of trees again. That's because it survived as a species. The seeds resprouted, but every tree on the landscape that day died and it started a whole new crop of trees again. And if you go back this area now, it'll be probably 30 to 40 foot tall trees. One of the things when we talk about fire regimes or fire on the landscape, one of the terms we talk about the intensity of the fire, how big those flames are, because that matters what happens to our plants, happen to our trees. It influences how fire and your plant communities have adapted to fire. There's three basic things that gives us fire intensity, which can be measured as flame length. We call it the behavior triangle. The weather is a key factor in how intense or how hot that fire will burn through your property. Topography affects it because fire goes uphill faster. Also, what plants and trees you have on the landscape, or i.e. the feel. The amount of that material, the condition of the materials that dry or moist, and the arrangement. The two key ones we focus on is weather and feel, because feel you as a landowner can change. Weather is the most unpredictable. Topography is always there. We know what it is. And so we'll be talking about those a little bit as we talk about fire regimes and how fire, how your community or how your plants may have evolved with or without fire. One of the other terms is what we call a fire regime. That's a set of recurring conditions of fire that defines your ecosystem. So what did fire do to the ecosystem to disturb it? And we kind of look at it two ways. Frequency, how often did fire historically come through your property, through the landscape? We also look at the intensity or the severity. That the severity is often correlated to the flame length. And what by severity is, how we kind of measure it is, when fire comes through an area, how much of the top of the plants, the trees are killed. A low severity fire, we generally say, is less than 25% of the plants have top kill, i.e. burn branches, burn needles, burn leaves. Mixed severity is 25 to 75%, and that's on a landscape level like this picture. We can see patches of solid dead trees, but the landscape level, we'd call this mixed severity, just because we have trees that didn't die and trees that died. So that's a key concept when about fire regime. We're not necessarily talking about acre by acre, but the landscape level, because you could be standing in this far side here in this black and say, well, this is all dead. It's not low or mixed. It would be what we call high. But again, we look at the landscape level. And this is what we call a stand replacement picture, where we had 75% or more of top kill of the stuff dying in that wildfire. So the key thing about other thing is that the vegetation on site affects this. How much, how accumulation of fuel will affect the intensity of the fire just as well as the weather. And we're going to go look at a couple sample sites and see what the fire regime was. We're going to start in Spokane County, my home turf. And a couple studies were done in Turnbull Wildlife Refuge and just south of Spokane, Dishman Hills, where they found it pre-European conditions, fire was very frequent there, every 10 to 15 years, and what we call low severity fire. Not a lot of top kill, generally a low intense fire as well, which means our flame lengths weren't huge, just like in this picture here. We're going to move up north a little bit to Stevens County, north of Spokane, where the temperatures are a little cooler in the summer. We get a little more precipitation there. So the weather pattern is changing from Spokane, which is dry, hot summers, to just a little cooler. And as we move up to northern Stevens County, we'll just start seeing our fire return interval starts being a much wider range, anywhere from 17 to over 40 years. So this is where we start getting more mixed severity fires. Kind of depends on the given year about how much damage that fire did to the ecosystem. And so I'm going to bop over now to Idaho, just because I have some data from there. In Idaho, when we go to the Coeur d'Alene Basin, there's much moisture than both Stevens, Spokane County, more closer to Western Washington. And we started seeing lethal fires every 190 years, fire regimes of all fires in the 60 to 80 year rotation in the Coeur d'Alene Basin. So our fire frequency was reducing, but we're getting more lethal fires or more closer to stand replacement fires. Now let's move over to Western Washington. Oh, looks like I might have two slides backward. This is a picture of Western Washington on the fire regimes there. We got four basic, or five. You got alpine, non-forest, don't burn. But the blue for Western Washington is what we call the very wet forest. Fire there will be very, very infrequent, just because the conditions just never get dry enough to support a fire. The dark greens is where there's still high moisture there. Still a lot of fuels, so the potential is there for big fires, but because of the moisture there and the cooler temperatures, we don't see what we call those very intense or stand replacement fires where we get 75% or greater top kill, because the weather just doesn't support it. That's the key thing. If you notice weather, most of Western Washington, we get in this light green, we do see stand replacement fires, and those are infrequent, every 100 to 500 years, depending on the area you're at, and they're usually catastrophic. They're killing everything. They're huge burns. They kill all the trees. They're big flames. In Western Washington, just like you have some conditions that somewhat mimic Eastern Washington, that's the yellow areas. It's a little drier. Maybe not as dry as Spokane, but maybe closer to what we call Stevens or Parnaway County here, where the conditions can, on a given year, when we have a dry spell going on, support some fire of size, and we call those, usually we get more mixed severity fire. So we're going to burn fairly intense, fairly a lot of heat, and one of the reasons they do that over there is your fuel loading on the ground is much higher than what we have in Eastern Washington. So you just got a lot more growth there. That green lush stuff, when it dries out, it can burn quite hot. Some data for Western Washington is, this is from assessment that was done in a couple of vegetation groups. In that yellow area I was talking about, that it's called the Douglas fir western hemlock dry conditions. It's kind of in the rain shadows, east side slopes of the Olympics. We do see some strand replacement fires around 300-year intervals, but mostly we see a mixed species, mixed severity fire is most of the fires. If we look at the spruce fir, which is more of the cooler conditions, or the Doug fir western hemlock wet, we do see stand replacement fires anywhere from 100 to 400-year return intervals. That's the normal regime you have there, is those big, large fires, very, very infrequent, which is totally different than Eastern Washington. Kind of summarize the differences between the two sides of the state. In Eastern Washington, our climate's warmer and drier. We have a longer fire season. We do have a lot more fires, especially from lightning, and generally our fields are lighter than yours, so we don't have as much stuff on the ground that can burn, which means historically we had less intense fire, just much more frequently than the people in Western Washington experience. That has changed recently, Eastern Washington. I'm sure you've heard that we have more intense fire. We see that in the news all the time. I'm not going into those details. You should watch the other videos on that to explain those reasons why we're having so much more intense fires in the state. Western Washington, it's cooler, wetter climate. Even the summers, you don't get as hot as Eastern Washington. Your fire season is generally much shorter than we have in Eastern Washington. And you have fewer lightning caused fires, but your fuel loading is much heavier. You have much more vegetation there, so your potential is much higher for high intense fires if you get the right weather pattern. One thing about fire, historically, this is summarizing again, and I'll be showing this later. In Eastern Washington, fires was frequent and low intense, like I talked about, and it mainly killed the small trees and left the larger trees there. So the fire generally killed the small branches and the small trees that hadn't developed the thick bark or their mechanisms to survive. Most trees were left alive. Western Washington, the fire historically was infrequent. It was stand replacement, which killed everything, and the forest basically started all over again. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what homeowners can do to help reduce the chance of their home surviving wildfire. We're experiencing more and more wildfires that have done damage and threatened homes and burned homes in Western Washington. A couple of years ago, I believe it was a summer fire that burned a couple of homes. So they're experiencing Western Washington. And we call this area where trees and homes come together the wildland urban interface. This is a fire near my house, actually, in 2016. And fire came through. The house had fire around it, and it did do some damage to the home. One of the things when I talk about protecting your home from wildfire is what you try and do. What I say is when bad things happen to you, the goal is that you get back to normal more quickly than if you had taken no action. And that homeowner I just showed you, because of the steps he did, yes, he had some damage to his property. Yes, he had some damage to his home. He didn't move out of his home, where a bunch of his neighbors had no home to go back to. So he accomplished this goal of getting back to normal more quickly because of the actions he had taken. That was about $30,000 of damage. The insurance company replaced the siding. He never had to move out of his house, so he was quite pleased with the work he did. One of the things when we're looking at protecting your home from wildfire, I always tell people, the first thing you should talk about, what are your goals? What are your property goals? If fire is the only thing you care about around your property, the goal is easy. Pave it. I've yet to find anyone who lives in the woods who want this type of landscape. So you got to balance your objectives and your goals. Is wildlife one of your goals? Is forest health one of your goals? You may have other goals. And one of those goals I often remind people that they may have is money. I've yet to work with anyone who didn't care about how much things cost. Everyone has a budget, and that factors as you manage your property of what financially or time-wise you have to commit it. So you got to set priorities. And my next exercise is kind of one of those things I use to help people prioritize what they're going to do and where. If you have a piece of paper, just draw a house on the center of a piece of paper like this. And some questions I always ask people. I did put the north arrow, so which way is north for this house? The first question I always ask people is circle where the heavy fuels are, like in this house. Heavy fuels give me intense flames. So I circled that. The next thing is topography makes fire grow hot, more intense. So where do I have steep slopes? You'll have to take my word for it. This is a slope on this side of the house. So I drew another circle where the steep slopes are. The last thing that makes fires more intense is weather, specifically wind. And so I asked homeowners, where does your afternoon summertime winds come from? For this home, it's from the southwest. Okay. So this helps me or people set priorities. Where are they going to start their work at? For me, the priority areas where you have more circles. And you can see the different priorities change. And so you now know where to focus first on protecting your home from wildfire, looking at those fuel areas. A couple things about your home. We have 3 ways heat transfers to your house so that it ignites. We have conduction heat. That's when flames actually touch your house and start it on fire. Radiant heat, that's the heat you feel from that campfire. And that can just spontaneously start on fire just from that radiant heat. The last thing is convection heat. Heat rises. People, well, how does heat rise and start my house on fire? Well, when heat in a wildfire, when that heat rises, it takes burning material we call embers and drops them around your house. So that convection transferred heat or embers a long ways from the fire, up to a mile plus, and can drop them around your house. So we're going to look at 3 zones around your home and look at them very briefly, zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3, and talk about steps that you can do around your home to reduce the impact of wildfire. Zone 1 and zone 2, doesn't matter where you are in the state or the nation. They're very, very similar. They're the same. Zone 3, we'll talk about a little about the differences between the 2 sides of the state. They're quite similar, but there's a couple of nuances we want to consider. One thing about protecting your home from wildfire, most people, because of the media, this is what they show, and these homes burning from big flames. Right now, as a firefighter, I'm not sure if this home will burn from those big flames. They may have taken steps to reduce around the backside of the house to get separation from them and the flames that may help that home survive. But we don't actually lose, less than half our homes are lost in this scenario. Most homes are lost by this. Small fires, large fires, it doesn't matter, where the heat from that convection heat from fire takes leaves, sticks, and bark, we call embers, and drop them around your home. And this can easily go a mile plus. This is a picture showing that example. This home burned down, but from what? We can tell from firefighters and looking at it, it didn't burn from the woods burning. Those trees aren't burned. These trees that are burned or show a lot of heat didn't come from the woods. They actually came from the house starting on fire from an ember, and those potentially killing these trees. So this was a house that started on fire from embers, not from the woods burning to the house. And people are amazed at how many homes are lost this way. A couple things when we look at this area is I always like to use a campfire scenario. To start a campfire with an ember or a match, I need tinder, kindling, and firewood. So when we're looking around this home in this zone 1 and zone 2, we're really looking at what can start on fire from a single match or an ember. This is an example of a cedar shake roof starting on fire from embers, and the right is an ember storm. We see that a lot in fires, just embers coming sideways or transferring miles. So where can an ember get into that can start something on fire? A couple things around your home is vents, making sure they're screened so they can't get inside your house. The left is a house vent. Most newer construction homes, the vents are pre-screened. The right is a greenhouse. Who would think about covering the greenhouse screen? But think about in the summer, what's in a greenhouse, not plants, storage. So think about the summertime, what's there. This one could be rectified easily to reduce embers getting in the greenhouse by closing the vents. It's just recognizing the things you can do, and some are quite easy, just like this one. 15 seconds, close the vents, you reduce embers getting that greenhouse. There's also, you gotta look around your house in this first zone. What's next to my house that could start from an ember? What's my furniture like? It would easily start from a match. The answer is yes, do something about it. Generally, newer furniture in good condition are less risk than older stuff because they get frilly and frayed. What about my recycling bin? What about my garbage? It- Is that next to my house? Can that start from an ember? Those are the things we're looking at to not have next to your house during fire season. Firewood piles is a classic example. We love to have firewood next to our house because we don't have to haul it in for the winter. But those are just asking for an ember start on fire. So it's a lot of these little things that can catch on fire from a single ember that's small in nature initially that can start your house on fire. I always encourage people before you go on vacation summer, check before you leave. I do a security check around my house as well as a fire check to make sure everything's put away. No one can find something easy to steal, and checking for little things that can catch on fire from an ember. This is what I call Mother's Day planter. We like to buy them for our wives, our moms for Mother's Day. Um, and I always ask people, what does it look like in August? Some of them look like this. And the key thing with these Mother Day planters, these are little things that can catch people is they're not filled with dirt. They're filled with peat moss, which can burn from an ember. That peat moss can start this dead vegetation on fire, catch the whole peat moss on fire, start the wooden deck on fire. Now you burned your house down. So it's removing those things. And how easy is it for me to get rid of this Mother's Day planter? Pick it up, throw it in my garbage can, cover my garbage can, resolve the issue in less than a minute. Landscaping around this zone 1, the first 5 feet is critical, having non-burnable landscape. This house was fortunate, didn't burn down. It had beauty bark, and which produced small flames, but where can those small flames start? Luckily, they had a plant here that didn't readily burn. Um, they did have some separation between those flames and the house, the siding there. But if I look to the left of the house, is what can, here I'm looking at what can a 3-inch flame start on fire? Up here, the siding gets close to the ground. Luckily, they had no beauty bark up there, so the fire couldn't go up the hill. But when we're looking at the house in this first 5 feet, things change as we go around the house like here. Here, they had the siding was over a foot from the ground. As we move to the left, you can see the siding comes very close to the ground. So getting rid of the beauty bark in that 5-foot zone or burnable mulch is the key in this 5-foot zone. So this first 5-foot zone, what we're calling the be ember aware zone, close to nothing can burn is your goal. Couple examples of some landscaping in this area this is just sand, green grass, rocks are great landscaping choice. Yes, you can have some plants in zone 1, less the better. These are nice healthy green plants in zone 1. So you're really trying to get this zone 1, nothing that can start on fire from a match or an ember. And that's the first 5 feet, because we call that the be ember aware zone, convection heat. And I'm going to show you a short video on why half a house can burn and half could not.
Uh-oh, God, we don't have audio and video.
Okay, sounds like we have no audio now. I'll just talk through this a little bit. And this is a study that has 2 sides of construction, good side and bad side. Fire resist instructions on the right and non-firewise principles on the left. Burnable mulch, you can see starting on fire now. Wooden deck, and that burnable mulch, the tender started the kindling, which is the deck, that wooden deck on fire, which is now starting the house on fire. On the right side, they had rock, and so that rock didn't start on fire, didn't catch the deck on fire. So one of the things we look afterwards, that mulch caught on fire, caught the deck on fire, caught the house on fire. So he's just showing you the flames from the deck is what caught the doors on fire. It's getting smoke inside the house. So the key things in decking, wooden decking is not a great choice, but the ways you can have it, like this fire resistant side of the house, they had a non-combustible zone around the house. This is rock, metal gutters, and you can see here, they do have embers down there, but the deck didn't catch on fire. Embers did accumulate on the material, but didn't ignite anything on fire. And one of the kind of things to talk about there is the vegetation was kept from the home. So if it did ignite, it wouldn't generate enough heat to start the home on fire. So you're really trying to separate that heat source from your structure. And I will post that video in the chat so you can watch it with sound. So that's zone 1, that first 5 feet. Zone 2, we call the lean, clean, and green zone. That goes out to 30 feet or more. That's, in a nutshell, is your yard and garden. The area you maintain on a regular basis, include your driveway, any area that you somewhat have changed drastically from the woods. And what we're trying to do is protect your home from that radiant heat. So when those big trees in the woods burning on fire, you got enough separation between your house and the trees that your house just doesn't go poof from those big trees burning near your home. This lot of studies been done in that, found out 30 feet is bang for your buck. More is better, but you're looking at the the cost efficiency of this. So a lot of people have actually fairly decent lean, clean, and green when I work with homeowners. The key thing when working with people in the woods, they don't always have it on all 4 sides of the house. That's the problem. They only may have on 1 or 2 sides of the house. That first picture of the one on Wellesley, he didn't have it very good on one side of the house. That's where the house got damaged. Um, so this is just some examples, some pictures in Eastern Washington, some nice flowers, green grass, a good lean, clean, and green zone, which is zone 2. This is a picture of Western Washington. This area here, I look, is pretty good. If I was looking at leaning it out, leaning is reducing the amount of fuels that can burn or heat generated in zone 2. I would be looking at this area here and reducing some of the fuel loading there. Just trying to reduce how much heat's generated there. And so just cleaning out the dead stuff. I might prune up that tree a little bit, remove some of the lower limbs. And so I'm just looking at leaning out. That's where I might lean. Less material in there than in the background, than in the woods. So a lot of people, your normal landscaping is actually pretty good when I visit zone 2. The biggest thing about zone 2 is lacking it on all 4 sides. One thing about plants, all plants will burn, but some plants are more fire resistant and will burn with less intensity than others. Flip side, some plants are explosive in nature. We have a couple of plant guides. The plant guide on left, the link I'll be posting in the chat. The plant guide in right is brand new, and we do not have it posted on a website yet. It will be coming there very soon on a website. But doesn't matter, both guides are great. The key thing is in plants, when we're looking to have plants in zone 1 or zone 2, you want plants that don't accumulate a lot of dead, that generally don't have a lot of dead material, makes it easy to maintain. An open, loose branching pattern. Not a lot of total vegetation there. They have a high moisture content. They're slow growing, and most are flowers and plants. One plant or two that I want to bring out is the arborvitaes or the thuja plants. We call these gas cans. They're highly flammable, they're very volatile, and they accumulate a lot of dead in them. As firefighters, we don't like them in zone 1 at all. Zone 2, we might tolerate them a little bit, but ideally get rid of them in zone 2 as well. Bad choice. One thing about zone 2, we always look at how fire can get to my house. We look for what we call wicks. Beautiful fence that goes out to the woods. You can't tell on the backside, but fire can burn from the woods to the fence because it's the property line, it's the end of the yard. The fence will burn, then we get fire coming down here, touching the house, nice landscaping, everything doing, but here's the weak link. We have a wick bringing fire to the house. So right now this fence is the problem, but it could be a relatively easy fix. Just replace that with metal. Replace the gate with metal. There you've broken the wick. Now we're going to go to zone 3, which is your woods, the area you don't maintain on a regular basis. The key thing what we're trying to do in zone 3 is reduce the energy. This is 30 feet to 100 plus feet outside your structure. So outside of zone 1 and zone 2. Reduce the energy is, instead of having big, huge flames like this, we're wanting flames like this. And people go, whoa, those are so pretty big flames on the right. Yes, but from a home standpoint and a firefighter standpoint, we can deal with the flames on the right. You significantly reduce the chances of impact if we get these smaller flames. Firefighters can put out the fire on the right, or on the left, air resources cannot even do anything with something that intense. So what we're trying to do in this unimproved area, this forest area, is create separation from plants so we don't get conditions like on the left where we get tree to tree ignition. So this is an Eastern Washington picture, very dense plants. And what we're making is separating the plants out, creating a place like this. So there's less fuel there to burn, less crown to crown ignition. And so once we're done with this in Eastern Washington, this will stay fairly lean and clean like this for 15 plus years before we get a serious amount of vegetation coming in because of the dry conditions. This is a typical Western Washington picture, a lot more vegetation in the understory. And after a place like this had some treatment, it may look something like this. Now, the difference here between Eastern and Western Washington is you guys have water in Western Washington. This vegetation has been really reduced here in the stand, but how quickly will it become thick again? Much more quickly than Eastern Washington. So the key thing in Western Washington is maintenance. Are you really going to treat your whole 10 acres? Can you maintain that? That's the key thing about Western Washington is you may just focus on that core 100 or 200 feet around your structure because of the maintenance issues. And that you do get a lot of bang for your buck from a home protection standpoint. That's all that's needed, 100 to 200 feet total around your homes. Spacing, people ask, well, how thin do I do it? We just recommend 5 feet between the branches when you're done. So we don't get crown to crown nation of branches going fire from tree to tree to tree. Over time, that will grow in, and as they start touching again, you'll need to go out again. Western Washington, you may want to go farther. We generally find in Eastern Washington, 5 feet is good for 10 to 15 years, so you don't have to maintain it every year. Western Washington, because of your faster conditions, you may need a little wider. And you can clump trees together and think of it as one big tree. So just have clumps separate from other clumps. One of the things about the roll of fire, back to the slide I showed you earlier, in Eastern Washington, when we're doing this thinning, we're actually mimicking a little bit the roll of fire, killing the small trees. Western Washington, removing small trees isn't part of the roll of fire. Fire in Western Washington killed all the trees. So that's one thing about Western Washington when you're doing this work, you're actually drastically altering the native ecosystem, or in Eastern Washington, we're mimicking it. A couple other steps to do around your home in this zone 3 is what we call pruning or removing ladder fuels. All these dead branches could carry fire, or green branches specifically can carry fire into the trees. We recommend 10 feet high above the vegetation. In Eastern Washington, that's generally 10 feet high. We don't have a lot of vegetation. Western Washington, that may be quite a bit higher than 10 feet. And you may go up to 14 feet along the road so the fire trucks can get in. This is what it would look like afterwards. Clean. And a lot of people like this look afterwards, so it's a good way to do it. One of the things is slash disposal is often a key thing. There's many ways to get it. Lop and scatter, which is leave on the ground. Massacate is a good one to use, especially in Western Washington because they can take your brush out. Chipping is another one, or you can pile and burn it. I'm going to wrap this up, but I want to share one example with you. Some steps are on this. I often, and you can throw your answer in chat, on this Ponders of Pine, this deck, the homeowner loves it, but where should this homeowner spend the $2,000 they have this year on protecting this cabin from wildfire? Should they cut or leave this pine tree? Throw it in chat. Cut, leave. So one of the things about this pine tree, it's a problem only if it's on fire. Okay, so that's the only way it's going to burn the house down, catch on fire. The question I have is, how will the pine tree start on fire? pine tree will start on fire by the deck burning. So the deck will start the pine tree on fire. See some nice answer in there? How will the deck start on fire? The deck will start on fire because the grass will start the deck on fire. So right now, my weak link, remember this, tender kindling fieldwood, is the grass. I would be focusing on rocking 5 feet around my structure first, my first priority. More than likely, that tree will catch on fire because the house started on fire from someone doing cooking or smoking in the house. That kind of wraps up my presentation. I'll put some stuff in chat for other follow-up videos. And let's open up questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Guy. That was great. So if anybody has questions that they've been holding on to, now's a great time to throw them in the chat. And this presentation has been recorded and will go up on the Winter School website in about a week. And you should receive an email notifying you that the recording is up. And we'll also post the links that Guy referenced today. So let's see. Our first question that we have is, what about cedar chips? Not beauty bark, right? I think this was in reference to the zone 1 area.
Any flammable material in zone 1 is bad. I don't care if they're, what term we use, beauty bark chips. If it burns, you don't want it in zone 1 as a mulch. Basically, it's rock or dirt, concrete in zone 1. So cedar chips are just as bad as beauty bark. They all burn.
Great. Okay, next question. Will heat-resistant plants for Eastern Washington grow successfully in Western Washington as well?
Depends. Some can, some can't. One of the things about these plant guides, they have the USDA charts on the USDA zones for the ornamental plants, which will tell you which those can go on both sides. And so it's really looking at those USDA charts as you select the plant and what conditions grow in. There's way more plants, landscape plants that we can use around our structure than we can't. The ones you're trying to avoid are the thuja, the arborvitaes, those cedar-looking needles. You're also trying to avoid anything that accumulates a lot of dead material. One of the things I look at is how easy it is to maintain the plant. The more older I get and the more I lose my labor force, i.e. my children leaving, the more I'm looking at how to reduce labor. And so you're looking for things that are easy for you to maintain as well. And so those things that don't have a lot of needles or leaves on, that don't drop a lot of dead. So you don't have to go rake with your hands, crawl underneath those plants. I've seen people to clean the plant out, you have to use your hands to get in, or a little hand tool. Who wants to get in the hands and knees every spring to clean out underneath their plants? So think about that when you're looking at some of these plants you're going to select.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. We were within a half block of the summer fire. The majority of our trees are cedar. You mentioned that cedars grow in a cooler, moist climate. I'm curious what your thoughts are on climate change impacting cedar health.
In a nutshell, that's a good question. Actually, it's going to stress them out. That's a whole nother topic matter that I could spend way too much, and there's people way smarter than me on how climate change affects the physiology of trees. I know big picture, we're trying to look at recommendations of different plants to plant in areas as climate change happens, and our tree species in the forest, we say they're going to shift north because it's going to get warmer, and all the tree species are going to shift up in hills up north. But they will stress trees, and Melissa might have been a good one to answer that earlier. She talked earlier because they were doing some research up here about similar cedar decline in Eastern Washington.
Yeah, and we also have a upcoming session. The next one in the same webinar room is with Henry Adams, and he'll be talking about trees, heat, and drought. So if you have some particular interest in that, you can just stick around in this room. Next question, what is the flammability of track stacking?
Track stacking is everything can burn. You're trying to find things that won't readily burn or delay and start and burn. Trex is a great choice. It doesn't easily burn, it doesn't readily burn, but if you have enough firewood underneath your Trex decking, it will burn. So again, it's the whole picture approach. Do I got things that easily ignite on fire? Get rid of that first. will it start my decking on fire? Trex decking is a good choice.
Great. Recommendations on roofing material.
Stay away from cedar shakes. Other than that, 3-tab is solid. I didn't go much into roofing because it doesn't burn easy. It's just keeping your roofing clean. Keep your gutters clean in the summer. Don't let a lot of needles accumulate in the valleys. The other thing is on, I call complex roofs. That's roofs that have dormers. Okay, you want to make sure those areas that have dormers that you don't accumulate material right under the dormer because that's wood, and you could have just a small group of needles under your dormer, which has wood siding touching it. So it's looking at those little things like that is what you want to make sure you get cleaned up. And those will accumulate over the summer. You get a little wind event, all of a sudden you get a little pile of needles on your roof next to your dormer. That's your weak spot. But the material of the roofing, 3-tab, which is the composite, even though it's oil base, it does not easily start on fire unless you got a bunch of stuff in your gutters.